Okay, so we've been talking about organic compounds. We have talked so far about carbohydrates and lipids. We need to talk about the third group of organic compounds, and those are proteins. Now, this is going to be a super short podcast because I want to use this one to just give you the basics about proteins. And then we're going to do another one that goes into a detail about a specific group of proteins that we call enzymes, but that's not going to be in this podcast. In this podcast, we're just going to go into general characteristics of proteins. Okay? So, let's get started. All right. Proteins are the third group of organic compounds. Just like all organic compounds, fundamentally they're based on carbon. There's also lots of hydrogen, and in proteins we'll see some other elements that we haven't talked about thus far, nitrogen and several other compounds, but mostly nitrogen is going to play a role in proteins. Okay? Now, what do proteins actually do? They do tons of stuff. Proteins are quite arguably perhaps the most important molecules, organic molecules that make up living things. They do all the work! Exclamation points. Proteins do all the work of your body. Yes, carbohydrates are great for energy. Yes, lipids are great for energy and other stuff. Certainly, lipids are important because they build cells, cell membranes. DNA that we're going to learn about later on. That's our last group. DNA is important because it contains the instructions for creating you. But it's proteins that do everything. It's proteins that allow your fingers to move and your brain to think and all of that. Proteins do all the work. They are incredibly important. Okay? So, proteins can do many things. First of all, they can build structures in your body. Okay? Your very hair is built of just protein. Okay? Muscle is built of protein. Incredibly important in that way. Okay? Proteins allow cells to talk to each other. Incredibly important for many reasons. Your nervous system wouldn't work without this. The parts within your cells, within each cell, parts move around, and it's proteins that direct the movement of those parts. But perhaps, arguably, the most important role that proteins play in your body is that they make up a very special group of chemicals called enzymes. Okay? Which is not to say that all these other purposes and functions of proteins and other things aren't important as well, but you could certainly make the argument that without enzymes, nothing that we know of about life would really be possible. They're an incredibly important group of compounds. Okay? All right, we're going to back off of that a little bit and just talk about how proteins are put together. Now, if you'll recall, when we talked about carbohydrates, when we talked about organic compounds in general, we had this little model here, okay, where we've got monomer, 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 and all the monomers together make up one big old polymer, and these are little covalent bonds linking all the monomers together. Well, that's how it works with proteins. It works that way with carbohydrates. Lipids are a little bit funky because if you'll remember lipid structure, you've got the glycerol and the 3 fatty acid groups sticking out. It's not quite a little choo-choo train motif, so that's a little funky. But this also follows the same basic pattern that we saw in the carbohydrates. A bunch of little monomers make up a great big polymer. Now, what are the monomers? Okay, the monomers of proteins are called amino acids. So it's quite analogous to carbohydrates. If this picture that I just drew up here was a carbohydrate, then each monomer we would call a monosaccharide, and this whole thing would be a polysaccharide. Well, in the case of proteins, each monomer, it still looks basically the same as far as its structure, but this time each monomer is going to be called an amino acid, and the amino acids are different from monosaccharide. They're not the same thing as a sugar. They're different. So the polymer they build is different also. And the polymer is called a protein. It is also sometimes called a polypeptide, and we'll talk about why that is later. Okay? So the monomers of proteins are amino acids. Now, amino acids have a certain basic structure, okay? You remember with carbohydrates, we talked about sugars, and sugars basically kind of have, you know, carbons around like this, and they've got these hydrogens sticking off them, and they've got kind of a basic pattern they follow too. Well, amino acids have this pattern that we see here. They always have a carbon in the middle, so if I wanted to draw a amino acid, I would draw a carbon like that. And remember, a carbon has 4 hands to hold, so it's got 4 places for covalent bonds to occur, okay? Now, there's always a hydrogen at the top, and top is relative because sometimes they draw it a little bit differently, but in a center position, there's always a hydrogen. So here is our hydrogen here, okay? And that's boring, and it's always the same for every single amino acid there is. But on one side, left or right, depending on how they decide to draw the molecule in the example, is a group with a nitrogen in it, and that is called an amino group. An amino group. It's just a funky little chemical group with nitrogen and hydrogen in it. That's it. You don't need to know any more than that. It's NH2. I'm going to draw it like that, okay? So that's the amino group. On the other side, whoopsie, sorry. On the other side is a carboxyl group right here. And again, you don't need to memorize this structure, but what I want you to note is it's called a carboxylic acid group. This is acid. This is where we get the name amino acid. Here's the amino group over here, the acid group over here. So this side has COOH, and that's where we get the acid from. Okay? Now, there are 20. How many? 20 different amino acids. Kind of like there's 20 letters in our alphabet, or 26 letters in our alphabet. There's 20 different amino acids. But I don't care which of the 20 you have, they all share the amino group, the H, the acid group, and the carbon atom. They all are exactly the same as far as that goes. Then what's different about them? What makes there be 20 different amino acids then? Because there is one chemical group attached to that carbon called an R group. And the R group can vary. It can be one of 20 different little chemical groups, okay? So depending what kind of amino acid you have depends totally on what is attached down here in this position, in that R position. And it can be one of 20 different little chemical groups, okay? 20 different types of R groups. And what's key about them is this right here. Every R group has its own different chemical characteristics. So basically, amino acids are really boring. They're all the same here. It is here where they get interesting. The R group gives them their personality. Maybe some are polar. Maybe some are non-polar. Maybe some like to cling to stuff. Maybe some don't like to cling to stuff. And whatever R group you put on that amino acid is going to give it its own unique little personality. Okay? That's really important for the way that proteins work. Okay? So, a protein is a polymer of amino acids. In other words, it's many amino acid, and these, remember, are the monomers, okay, stuck together. That's what a protein is, okay? the amino acids are linked together. So if this is an amino acid here, I'm going to draw a circle, I'm going to write AA. So this is a carbon with that hydrogen, with the carboxyl group, the amino group, and the R group. That's what is represented by this circle. And we've got a bunch of them glued together, okay? They are linked, as always, by covalent bonds. In a protein, the covalent bonds get a special name. It doesn't mean anything special is different about the covalent bond. It just means for whatever stupid reason, scientists have to go and give it a special name, okay? And that name is peptide bonds. That's helpful because now we understand why sometimes these protein chains are called polypeptides, because poly just means many and peptide refers to all these little peptide bonds that are in between them. Okay, so proteins and polypeptides are long chains of amino acid. Okay, so we see that reference. Okay, now please remember, just like with carbohydrates and even with lipids, they form this way as well. Dehydration reactions, dehydration synthesis is what lets them stick together. You get if you've got two amino acids, here's one and here's one, there's going to be an OH and an H and an OH and an H hanging off the ends of them. We're going to grab those right there, pull them out. That's going to remove water, and what's going to be left is a covalent bond between them. That's dehydration synthesis. They are formed the same exact way as what we learned about in the very beginning of this organic chemical discussion. Okay? Here you see. Now this slide I think looks a little complex, but if you look at it, it really is not. This here, what I'm drawing a circle around, that is an amino acid. It's got all the parts we just talked about. It's got a carbon, it's got a hydrogen. Notice they drew it hanging off the bottom instead of the top. It's got an amino group, and it's got an acid group. And what the heck is this thing? I haven't seen any it's talking about anything with S's in it. Well, guess what? This is the R group, and it's what makes it different. Okay? This is also an amino acid here, and look at its R group. Its R group looks completely different. This is an amino acid over here. Its R group is completely different. Now, if we want to take this amino acid and connect it to this pair of amino acids to grow the chain, we're just going to take these two, the H and the OH out and form water, and then as you can see, we get a covalent or peptide bond in its place. Okay, and then they would be a group of 3 instead of just a group of 2 plus 1. All right, so let's see. All right, that's it. We're going to stop there, and then the next podcast will take your handout further as we talk specifically about the protein group of enzymes. All right, thanks for watching. I will catch you in the next podcast. Take care.